Trying to choose the right index fund can make you want to pull your hair out, but never fear because your boy is here, and I'm going to show you today the best index funds that you can buy at Fidelity. Now, if you don't know, my three favorite brokerages to buy index funds are Vanguard, Fidelity, and Charles Schwab. So today we're going to go over some of my favorite Fidelity index funds. Now, why I love index funds is because they're extremely well diversified. They have proven historic performance, and in addition, most professional money managers try to beat the performance of index funds, and usually they fail. So this is a way for you to not have to try to beat the market. Instead, what you can do is become the market, and that is the power of index funds. So today, let's go through each of my 6 favorite Fidelity index funds. Number 1 is FXAIX. And now what FXAIX is, it's the Fidelity 500 index fund. And what that 500 stands for is the S&P 500. And if you've never heard of the S&P 500, it's a little above 500 of the largest companies in the US stock market. Now, why we love the S&P 500 is because you're investing in the 500 best companies in the US stock market, which are usually 500 of the best companies in the world. And it's an amazing investment to look into, and it's an amazing way to invest your dollars. And the cool thing about the S&P 500 is that if a company is not doing well, what happens is they will fall out of the S&P 500 and a better company will come into play. Whereas if you invested in individual stocks and say, for example, you bought a stock that really isn't performing well, well, your entire portfolio will go down because that stock isn't performing well. That's not the same with an index fund in the S&P 500. With the S&P 500, if a stock is struggling, they kick it out and a better stock comes into play. This is why index funds truly perform very well. Now, FXAIX has a really low expense ratio at 0.02%. This is fantastic because fees will absolutely destroy your wealth over time if you do not take care of those fees. In addition, it has a 1.62% dividend yield, meaning you're going to get those dividends every single quarter. And the best way, if you want to build wealth, is to make sure that you reinvest those dividends every single month. And they have a 2% turnover ratio. What this means is that they are not trading a bunch of stocks in and out of the market. Instead, they are just mirroring that index so that you pay less taxes when they don't trade as much. Whereas mutual funds, you'll see a really high turnover, 50%, 60%, something like that. And that means that you're paying more taxes. And they have a 10.37% annualized total return at the time I'm recording this. Now, this is a fantastic return over time, and you can build a tremendous amount of wealth just investing a small amount of money over time. And this is very consistent with the S&P 500. Now, if we look at returns over the last 3 years, it's returned 8.25%. Over the last 5 years, it's returned 9.10%. Over the last 10 years, 12.54%. And over the last 15 years, 9.8% at the time recording this video. And this is why we love the S&P 500, because the top 10 holdings are companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's company, Tesla, United Healthcare, Johnson & Johnson. These are all amazing companies that you're investing in when you invest in something like FXAIX. Number 2 is FZROX. Now, FZROX is the first of its kind. It is Fidelity's zero total market index fund. Now, why this is powerful is because it has zero in the name. What does that zero stand for? It has a 0% expense ratio. This is the first of its kind to ever do that. The competition was so stiff between all of these companies, Vanguard, Charles Schwab, and Fidelity, that Fidelity introduced a fund that had 0% expense ratio, probably to attract more investors to their company. So if having a 0% expense ratio makes you go, say what? Well, just hold on one second, because there are some catches to having a 0% expense ratio that we'll talk about here in a second. Now, the first thing to know about FZROX is that it invests in the total stock market, meaning you're buying a piece of every single stock in that US stock market. Now, this is an incredible way to invest your dollars. And in fact, the book, The Simple Path to Wealth, really likes total stock market index funds and argues that you can have just a total stock market index fund. This would be comparable to something like VTSAX at Vanguard, for example. Now, it has a 1.49% dividend yield that you receive every single quarter that you want to just keep reinvesting if you're trying to build wealth. In addition addition, it has a 3% turnover rate, so not a lot of buying and trading, which is a good thing for your tax bill. And it has an all-time return of 9.45%. Now, FZROX has not been around for a very long time. In fact, it hasn't even been around for 5 years yet, which is one of the drawbacks because you want to look at funds that have been around for a very long period of time. But as it mirrors that total stock market index, it's something where you still have alternatives that we'll talk about here in a second. That is one of the downsides. Now, let's look at some of the top 10 holdings in there as well. The top 10 holdings in FZROX are going to be very familiar to you: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, United Healthcare, a bunch of similar companies that are in the S&P 500 index fund. Now, here are the downsides. The first downside is it doesn't have a long historic performance, meaning it doesn't have a long track record yet. It's a very new fund. They just introduced these a few years ago. So looking for funds with longer track records sometimes are a safer bet. But as long as it's mirroring that index and you do your research, then it could definitely be something that you'd be interested in. In fact, I hold FZROX in my Fidelity portfolio. The second downside is you can't transfer the fund if you leave. Whereas other index funds that are within the Fidelity umbrella, you can actually transfer those if you go to another brokerage account. FZROX, you cannot transfer. So this is a key to note here as you think about this index fund. So those are the two potential downsides. And if you want to hedge against those downsides, but you want to pay an expense ratio, then the next one is going to be a perfect option for you. Hey, if you're getting value out of this video, make sure you smash that like button and hit subscribe as well. Now, number 3 is FSKAX. Now, with FSKAX, this is the Fidelity Total Stock Market Index Fund. Now, this is very similar to FZROX, only you're going to pay that expense ratio, and it has a much longer track record. And you can also transfer this to other brokerages. So it solves all the problems of FZROX if those are problems for your personal situation. Now, its expense ratio is still extremely low at 0.02%. Its dividend yield is 1.54%, so very comparable to FZROX. And it has an annualized total return of 7.97%. Because it's been around for a longer period of time, it has a lower return than does FZROX. Now, we can look at its all-time returns and kind of go through the last 15 years. So over the last 3 years, it's had a 7.21% return. Over the last 5 years, it's had an 8.45% return. Over the last 10 years, it's had an 11.99% return. And over the last 15 years, it's had a 9.71% return. And the top 10 holdings are also going to be companies that you've heard of: Alphabet, which is Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, all companies that you are definitely familiar with. Now, I think having a total stock market index fund is a key holding in a lot of portfolios. A lot of people are going to love having that because it gives you well-diversified fund with access to large cap stocks, things that are in the S&P 500, but also access to small cap stocks as well. And if you look at small cap stocks, you may not have heard of a lot of those, but in addition, what happens is, imagine if you invested in Apple when it was a small cap stock. So you get access to all of those stocks as well, and you are extremely well diversified, being in thousands of companies when you invest in this index fund. And number 4 is one I don't see a lot of people talking about, and it is FNCMX. Now, this is the Fidelity NASDAQ fund. Now, the interesting thing about the NASDAQ is over the last 10 years, the NASDAQ has actually outperformed the S&P 500. And a lot of people overlook this fund, but it is really one that could be a hidden gem over time. Now, the NASDAQ typically tries to track the 100 largest companies in the U.S. stock market, so the top 100. So you get a little less diversification than something like an S&P 500 or the total stock market index fund. But in addition, you still get access to 100 different companies all buying one index fund. Now, its expense ratio is a little bit higher than some of these other funds, where it's at 0.29%. Whereas, for example, the total stock market index fund we just talked about was 0.02%. So it's 0.27% higher than would be for the total stock market index fund. But at the same time, that is still a really low expense ratio. Now, its dividend yield is also lower at 0.83%. And its turnover is higher at 7.0%. The reason for that is there are less companies within this fund, and so every time they switch out a company, that turnover percentage is going to be at a higher rate. Now, the total all-time returns are absolutely fantastic at 10.7%, and you can really build a lot of wealth at 10.7% over a very long period of time. Now, let's look at the performance over the last 15 years because they are absolutely fantastic. So, over the last 3 years, it's been 6.74%. Over the last 5 years, it's been been 9.62%. Over the last 10 years, it's been 14.58%. And over the last 15 years, 11.98%. If you can get 11.98% over the course of 15 years, you are really having a compounding machine for you when you invest in these index funds. Now, the top 10 holdings are going to be very similar to a lot of these other index funds as well that hold the highest weight here. It's going to be Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all companies that you've heard of. But in addition, in here, we have Costco, we have Pepsi. These are some companies that are not in the top 10 holdings when you look at them for the S&P 500 or for the total stock market index. Now, if you want to build a 3-fund portfolio, one thing that you have to have is you have to have international exposure. And if you don't know what a 3-fund portfolio is where you buy 3 different index funds. You buy a S&P 500 index fund or a total stock market index fund that is a US-based fund. You buy an international fund, and you buy a bond index fund. And you can weight those in any which way that you want to. But if you want that international exposure, then Fidelity has an option for you. And one is the Fidelity Total International Index, which is FTI HX. Now, this gives you exposure to a bunch of different international stocks. It has an expense ratio of 0.06%, so a really inexpensive fund to own. And it has a little bit of a higher dividend yield at 2.32%. It has a low turnover ratio of 3.0%, but its annualized total returns are much lower than some of these other funds have been so far. They are 5.86%. Now, the top 10 holdings are going to be very different than the S&P 500 or the total stock market index fund or the NASDAQ 100 because these are all international stocks. So one thing you want to look at when you're looking at international funds is you can compare the top 10 holdings of international funds to the top 10 holdings of something in the S&P 500 and saying, would I prefer to just put all my dollars into the S&P 500 or would I prefer to have some of this additional exposure for additional diversification? That is a question that you have to ask yourself. Some people argue that you don't need all of that international exposure because the US-based companies work so much with international companies. For example, you can take a look at Apple. Every part of Apple, every part of the iPhone, for example, is built overseas, and it's built in various different countries and then put together and then sold here in the US and internationally as well. So some of the top 10 holdings that you may have heard of within an international fund like this is Nestle, Samsung, Shell, and Taiwan Semiconductor. But like I said, as you can see, these companies may not be as strong as some in the S&P 500, hence why the returns are a little lower. But you can build a 3-fund portfolio based on your risk tolerance at whatever percentage you want of these total international funds. And then the last one, if you want to build a 3-fund portfolio, you're going to need some bond exposure as well. Now, the reason why a lot of people will invest in bonds is because if you don't like how volatile the market is if you invest in all stocks, meaning how often your stocks go up and down in value, then bonds are going to help you level that out a little bit more. And the cool thing about that is it helps people who become emotional with their investments reduce that volatility a little bit. So FXNAX is the Fidelity US Bond Index Fund. And this is a fantastic index fund for a lot of folks who are interested in having that bond exposure. Now, the expense ratio is extremely low at 0.02%. The dividend yield is 2.16%. The all-time total return is 5.16%. And the turnover ratio on this is much higher at 50%. Now, for the most part, the top 10 holdings in these funds will be different variations of U.S. Treasury notes with different maturity dates. But in addition, they also hold mortgage-backed securities. Now, we can look at the long-term rate of return here and see what we are looking at. So over the course of the last year, it's been negative 9.10%. Over the last 3 years, negative 2.22%. Over the last 5 years, 0.69%. Over the last 10 years, 1.29%. And over the last 15 years, 2.58%. So this is why, for a lot of people, if you are younger, a lot of people say you don't need as much bonds in your portfolio because you have a longer time horizon for your money to compound, and you don't want to waste your time having too many bonds in your portfolio. I am of that opinion, and for me, I invest most of my money into index funds that hold stocks. Why? Because stocks have historically outperformed bonds. Now, as you get closer to retirement age, a lot of people will add more bond exposure over that time frame, which is why we have this bond fund here. Now, listen, if you guys are interested in learning how to invest in index funds step by step with our complete system, we have a course called Index Fund Pro that you can check out. We will link it up down below. We made it really inexpensive so that everybody can access it and learn how to invest their dollars. In addition, if you guys have any questions, leave them down in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell as well, and we will see you on the next video.